Welcome back. So this lecture starts us off on a new unit of mammalian structure and function, one that focuses on locomotion. We're first going to go through some very basic characteristics of mammals that have to do with locomotion, first concentrating on the skeleton. If the characteristic has an asterisk by it, it means it's a diagnostic characteristic. That means that only mammals show this particular characteristic. So if we look at very basic skeletal features, the first thing that we run across is that at the base of the skull of a mammal, there are two occipital condyles. So occipital refers to the back, very back portion of the cranium, and condyles are little knob-like structures that stick out from the back of the cranium. So we're going to take a couple of looks at a dog cranium, and I will show you where the occipital condyles are. So here's our dog cranium. We're looking at it from the side, and what we're looking at is right on either side of the foramen magnum. So that's the big hole at the back of the cranium where the spinal cord goes in. On either side of that hole are two bony knobs that stick out at the back of the cranium. So that's where you find them in a side view. If we look at another view looking from the underside of the cranium, we find the foramen magnum at the back of the cranium here. And again, we see the occipital condyles, one on either side of the back of the cranium. This is a diagnostic feature of mammals, so only mammals have those two knobs. Reptiles and presumably the proto-mammals that had a lot of reptilian characteristics, they only have one occipital condyle. And the significance of this has to do with movement of the cranium in relation to the neck. One occipital condyle actually makes the neck and the head more flexible. There's only one knob for everything to attach to, and so it can move in all kinds of different ways. So it's not as controlled a movement as is possible for mammals with two occipital condyles. So that somewhat restricts the motion of the head in relation to the neck, but makes it much more efficient. And we'll take a look at the vertebrae in a minute, and I'll show you what the implications are of that for mammalian movement. The second characteristic that all mammals share, a diagnostic characteristic, is the presence of epiphyses. So if you look at long bones through the body, so those are bones like the leg bones and the ribs and the arm bones. They have sections where bone growth occurs. This is a picture of a wrist radiograph. This is what's done to diagnose a lot of growth abnormalities in humans. And what you'll see on here is a bunch of the bones. So this is a long bone, and this is another long bone of the forearm. These are finger bones, all of these, and they're not solid bones. What you see on the radiograph, if it's white, it's a bone. If it's dark, that means there's no bone, hard bone, calcified bone in there. So at the ends of all these bones, you see that there's an area that's not calcified. That's the epiphysis. That's the place where growth occurs. So you'll see that very clearly here. You'll see it in the fingers where there's the lines. And you'll also see that some of the epiphyses, you'll see it here too, are calcified. So what happens is that when the mammal is young, the bones get longer by adding length at the epiphysis. So the joint itself doesn't grow longer, but the middle part of the bone does grow longer. And then when the mammal is done growing, this area gradually calcifies and it stops growing. So once these seams are all white and the bone the two parts of the bone are knit together, then no more growth is possible. So this is actually a huge development for mammals. If you look at other vertebrates, when they grow, they add extra bone to the end. So the end just keeps extending and extending and extending as the animal grows. And that obviously helps the animal grow, but it decreases the efficiency of the structure of the joint. If you remember back probably to high school where you learned about the human body and joints, you know that there are a lot of different kinds of joints through the body, right? You have hinge joints like in your elbow that just allow the two bones to move forward and back to each other. There are ball and socket joints like your hip or your shoulder that allow a very wide range of movement of the arm in relation to the body. And there are various other sorts of joints that are very specialized for a certain kind of movement based on their structure. So this again is how structure ties to function. The joints are extremely specialized in mammals, and that enables them to have very efficient movement for certain purposes. So in limbs where they need a wide range of motion, they have one kind of joint. In limbs where they need a smaller range of motion, they have a different kind of joint, and so on. Other vertebrates aren't capable of this high degree of specialized locomotion because their joints are more generalized because of the way they grow, because of adding more bone onto the end of the bone. That compromises the structure of the joint and makes the movement of that joint much less efficient than what we see in mammals. The third thing that we see a lot of in mammals is a tendency towards fusion of bones. So if you look at the pelvis, it's composed of several different bones that are all fused together to form one solid mass. The cranium, composed of a lot of different bones fused together to make a single solid structure. And the fusion enables there to be more strength in the structure. So again, that's important for locomotion for mammals because they have very specialized forms of locomotion, and the bones may be under a lot of stress. This fusion helps stabilize the body. So we're going to take a closer look at a few different features of skeletal structure. And again, we're going to look at the two parts of the skeleton, the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. So remember, the axial skeleton is the part of the skeleton that runs from the cranium down the vertebrae. The ribs are part of the axial skeleton and all the way through the end of the vertebrae through the tail. So if we look at the vertebrae, mammals are very specialized in having 5 different types of vertebrae that are easy to distinguish from each other. Here we go. So these are human vertebrae. There are slight differences between humans and some other mammals, but in general, mammals are very similar to each other. So the first set of vertebrae are the cervical vertebrae, and those are the ones in the neck region. All mammals, with just a couple of exceptions, have 7 cervical vertebrae. So a giraffe has the same number of vertebrae as a mouse. You've probably heard that in mammal trivia before. The second set of vertebrae are thoracic vertebrae. Those are the ones that are in the thorax region of the body, so near where the heart and lungs and vital organs are. And the thoracic vertebrae are distinguished by having ribs attached to them. So if we look at this diagram, here in purple are the thoracic vertebrae, and each of them has a rib that forms a cage around the vital organs in the thorax. So that makes that part of the spinal column very, very rigid and forms a protective structure around the vital organs. Then beneath that are the lumbar vertebrae. These do not have ribs, and so that enables this part of the spine to have a lot of flexibility. So that's very important for different forms of movement in mammals. It also has a downside. If you know people with bad backs, that's generally because they have issues going on here with these lumbar vertebrae that are very flexible and easy to bend. Then we have the sacral vertebrae. These are fused together and form part of the pelvis. So this is the way that the appendicular skeleton, the hind limbs, attach to the axial skeleton through the sacrum. And then finally we have the caudal vertebrae. Those are the tail vertebrae. In humans, they don't stick out outside the body, and we give it a different name, the coccyx, but they are caudal vertebrae. And these vary greatly from species to species. So you have some species like humans that basically don't have a tail, that just have a few tiny fused vertebrae down there, to something like a mouse that would have a very long tail with many, many vertebrae in that tail. So we worked our way through most of the vertebrae. I just want to show you one more slide, and that's looking at the very first two cervical vertebrae, the atlas and the axis. It's the second figure here. So this is the atlas, and this is the one that goes right up against the two occipital condyles. So these surfaces are joints between the first vertebra and the cranium. The axis has this peg sticking up through it that enables side-to-side rotation. So it twists around in relation to the other vertebra. So in combination, these two vertebrae allow up and down nodding of the head and side-to-side twisting of the head. And so that allows mammals to have a wide range of motion, but to have it carefully controlled. So it's not like it's flopping around and able to move in any direction. It's very, very carefully controlled. Alrighty, so the particular structures of the vertebrae have significance for homeothermy. We talked about homeothermy a good bit in the last few weeks. We're going to go back to proto-mammals, so things like Dimetrodon that are not mammals but are close relatives to the first mammals. And we're going to watch a short video.
Years ago, moved. We know from this research that Dimetrodon probably walked like an alligator. Since they had sprawling, short limbs and very rigid shoulders, they had to swing their bodies from side to side in order to move forward. That swinging motion is called lateral undulation and is employed by living animals like lizards and snakes today. However, this movement makes it tricky for reptiles to breathe, because as the animal moves, they end up compressing one lung and expanding the other. Reptiles lack the muscular diaphragm that mammals have, and as a result, they need to move their chest muscles in and out in order to breathe, which isn't possible when moving in a side-to-side pattern. Because of this, lizards can move very fast, but only in short bursts before needing to stop and catch their breath, which means it's likely that Dimetrodon was also limited to running in bursts, and probably wasn't winning any marathon races. Mammals, on the other hand, can endure running and traveling long distances. We've got some of the greatest stamina of any animal on the planet. That's because the thoracic part of a mammal's body is highly specialized into a stiff cage with a muscular diaphragm that acts as a piston for breathing. This frees our lower back, the lumbar region, to help with movement. Instead of...
Alrighty, back to that video. And so the side-to-side flexion that we see in reptiles and in the proto-mammals means that only one lung can kind of fill up at a time, and the other lung is squashed as the critter is wiggling from side to side as it's moving. On the other hand, in mammals, they've evolved a different system where the lungs are compressed during certain parts of locomotion, and then as the mammal stretches out in another part of their steps, the lungs expand. So they actually are breathing in time with the way they're moving, which is very, very efficient. All right, the last few things have to do with the appendicular skeleton and some patterns that we see in the appendicular skeleton. The basic parts we've talked about before. The pectoral girdle is what attaches the forelimbs to the body. We have forelimbs, the hand bones, manus, the thumb, which is the pollex, and the phalanges, which are the fingers, and then the pectoral girdle, which attaches the hind limbs to the body, including the foot, the pes, the big toe, the hallux, and the phalanges. And then finally, mammals, the ancestral mammals had 5 digits on each foot or hand, and the phalangeal formula is 2, 3, 3, 3. That means the first digit has 2 joints, all the remaining digits have 3 joints. If you look at your own hands and feet, you see the exact same pattern. So we are ancestral in terms of mammalian anatomy. So here you can see the thumb, and there are 2 joints or 2 bones that make up the thumb, and 3 bones that make up each of the fingers. 2, 3, 3, 3.